Okay, today we're going to talk about egoism, the view known as egoism. We will be discussing this topic both in Thursday's class this week, the 12th, and then next Tuesday as well. There are 3 readings on the topic. One is an excerpt from Plato's Republic. That's the longest dialogue of Plato's, the most famous one too, starring Socrates as usual. And another of the readings is an excerpt from Ayn Rand's novel, Atlas Shrugged. And then the third reading is an essay by James Rachels, who is a moral philosopher. He tries to lay out various arguments for and against egoism. The first thing I want to do is distinguish 2 forms of egoism. But before we get to that, here's a piece of background, if you like. So last class, we talked about the possibility that there are certain moral rules that have to be in place for any society to survive. So we have to care about truth-telling, and we have to condemn stealing and murder. In order to have a viable society, we have to teach our children that it's wrong to steal, and it's wrong to kill, and it's right to tell the truth, and it's wrong to lie, and have a legal system in place that upholds these values so that we can have a society where we're not having to constantly look over our shoulder and protect ourselves. We're not doubting everything that anybody says. We can have reliable communication and so on. The thing about these kinds of moral rules, and moral rules in general, more specific ones included, is they assume that we are capable, we can and we should take into account other people's interests as well as our own, right? So when we tell the truth, when we prevent killing, summary killing, when we respect other people's property and lives, we are taking their interests into account and acting accordingly, the interests of those who are at risk from attack by us or who we could lie to, say. There is a view, namely egoism, that challenges this sort of underlying assumption when we're talking about moral rules and values. The egoist says we are not the kind of creatures, in fact, that can act on others' interests. We are fundamentally, most basically selfish. We can only be motivated if there's something in it for us. Even if that's not immediately obvious, it seems like we are doing something in the interests of others, but deep down there must be a selfish motive, otherwise we wouldn't do it, we wouldn't be so motivated. That view is one of 2 versions of egoism we need to talk about. It's known as psychological egoism. It's a descriptive view that says how things are. It's a view about our psychology, what motivates us. It says we are this way, we are only motivated out of self-interest. That's psychological realism. Then there's a view which is known as ethical egoism, which is the prescriptive or normative version of egoism. So instead of saying we are this way, we can only act in this way, ethical egoism says here's how you should act. We ought to act only on our own interests. We ought to behave egoistically. Now these 2 views, it's very important to distinguish them because one's descriptive and one's prescriptive or normative, and also because they're incompatible. So take Ayn Rand, the most famous recent defender of ethical egoism. She is recommending that we only act in our own interest. She's saying, here's what you should do. She's giving a prescription. And she's also telling us what's right. This is a normative theory. So she's saying the right thing to do is whatever's in your interest, and only what's in your interest. She actually has to assume the falsity of psychological egoism in order for it to be worth her giving a defense of ethical egoism. She has to assume that we can act on our own interests or on another's interests in order to argue that we should make a choice. We should choose to act only on our own interests. If there was no choice there, if we weren't capable of acting on others' interests, there'd be no point putting together an argument saying we should act on our own interests. If there's no alternative, fine, right? So, Rand, for example, is defending ethical egoism and relying on a denial of psychological egoism. Before we get to Rand, let me say a bit more about psychological egoism. So the excerpt from Plato's Republic it sort of starts with an assumption of psychological egoism, the descriptive view. Socrates is in conversation with Glaucon, and Glaucon wants to push Socrates to defend his view about the intrinsic value of justice or morality, moral rules, principles of justice, that the view that we would choose the right thing, the just thing, under any conditions, even if we didn't have to, say, even if there was nothing in it for us. Glaucon wants to push Socrates to defend this view further. So what he does is he plays devil's advocate, and he says, here's the common view about the value and origins of morality or justice. How are you going to defend your view, Socrates, against this view? So what's the common view? The common view is highly cynical. The common view says morality, moral rules, a system of moral rules or of rules of justice, is just a self-interested compromise or agreement that we implicitly share with one another. So we have, in fact, a natural desire to go after whatever we want. So we have a natural desire to do wrong, just to follow our own interests. But we also have a strong desire to avoid harm. And if we could get away with it, we would do whatever we want, ignore other people's interests. But then we would be at risk from everyone else doing the same and harming us in the pursuit of their own interests. So what we do is we agree to follow certain rules and not just do whatever we want to. So we restrict our freedom in a certain way, just insofar as everyone else follows the same rules. So we agree to condemn murder and theft and lying, just to use the same examples, so that everyone else does too, condemns those things, and we can be sure that we're not going to be summarily, randomly attacked, or at least the chances go down given the threat of penalty. So that's all morality is. That's all that justice is, a self-interested contract. If we could get away with just going after our own interests, we would. And that's precisely what we see with the example in the reading involving this character, Gyges, who's a peace-loving and gentle shepherd, until he gets hold of a ring of invisibility, which allows him to get away with anything and escape punishment, and he turns into this tyrannical, murderous, adulterous fiend. And that would be any of us. We're supposed to see ourselves in Gyges. It's a sort of a way to really give the argument some force. And we'll see that Socrates is going to respond, and he's going to say, actually, even if we could get away with doing whatever we wanted and just taking what we want, sacrificing other people for what we want, we wouldn't. Because doing the right thing is the only way to ensure our own psychological health. Health is something that has intrinsic value. It's valuable for its own sake and as a kind of precondition for living a life worth living. So we choose health, we choose physical health, we choose psychological health. And the way Plato is thinking, as he's speaking through Socrates, the way he's thinking about psychological health is in terms of a balance, an internal balance where our reason guides our desires and emotions. And that's what it is to act in accordance with morality. Now you might think, This view seems to be recommending or subscribing to ethical egoism, because isn't it telling us that we should do what's in our interests? Namely, we should do what ensures our psychological health, which happens to be the right thing. Well, no, that's not what Plato's claiming. He's claiming that we value morality for its own sake, like health, and also as a precondition for living a good life, for living a life in which we can flourish. But what it is to do the right thing or act morally is to take other people's interests into account. So when we care about other people, when we act so as to take their interests into account as well as our own, then we ensure psychological health. So there's a prior assumption that what's right is to help others, to take their interests into account when it makes sense to do so. And then there's this argument about what that gives us as individuals as well as what that gives others. So this brings us on to ethical egoism. And the Plato reading is nice because it involves an assumption of psychological egoism, and then Socrates' response, which might seem to assume the other view, ethical egoism, the prescriptive normative view, but in fact it doesn't. And we can talk more about that in class. But on to ethical egoism and an actual argument for it, which is given by Ayn Rand in Atlas Shrugged. Before we come to Rand's argument, very quickly, you'll see in the Rachel's reading, James Rachel's, that he wants to be careful that you understand up front what ethical egoism is as a view. So it's the view that we ought to exclusively, solely act in accordance with our own interests. It's not the view that we should act so as to pursue our own interests and those of others. That's that kind of balance. And it's not, but it's also not the view that we should avoid acting in others' interests, because it might be that acting in others' interests is the best way to secure our own interests in some situation. And finally, it's not the view that we ought to just do whatever gives us the most immediate pleasure, because what gives us immediate pleasure might not be what's in fact in our best interests, like having a cigarette, right? So the view is that we ought to do what's we ought to do what's in our interests, what's really in our interests in the long term exclusively, right? Okay, Rand, in her defense of the view, uses a lot of emotive language, strong emotive language. She talks about the ethics of altruism, which she says is the morality that we already live with, the view about what the right thing to do is, which she thinks is always the altruistic action. She calls this the morality of self-sacrifice. It involves us whoring out our souls in order to serve others, and we become parasites on one another. We have to rely on other people to meet our needs rather than our own best efforts. So she uses this very strong language, which is different than actually giving us reasons for subscribing to ethical egoism. But she does have a continuous line of argument through this piece, and there are subsidiary arguments as well. But James Rachel's reconstructs the main line of argument. So this is on your handout, and you'll see it in the Rachel's reading as well. So just to read through it with you, the first premise, there are 4 premises. A person has only one life to live. If we value the individual, then we must agree that this life is of supreme importance. It's the only life you have. Second premise, the ethics of altruism regards the life of the individual as something one must be ready to sacrifice for the good of others at any time. So, premise 3, the ethics of altruism doesn't take seriously the value of the individual. By contrast, premise 4, ethical egoism does. In fact, it's the only view that takes seriously the value of the individual. Therefore, conclusion, we ought to accept ethical egoism, the view on which we should only act in our own interests. We can go into detail in class about whether this argument works and how it works, but here's just one consideration to think about before class. This argument relies on giving us two alternatives and implying that there are only two alternatives. Either there's an ethics of altruism or total self-sacrifice, or there's the ethics of egoism. But you might think there are other alternatives in the middle, so to speak. You might think sometimes we act on our own interests, sometimes on the interests of others, sometimes we are expected to do the right thing. We're expected to weigh our interests against the interests of others and see whose interests it's most important to meet, and those could be ours or someone else's. That would be a view it would be an additional or alternative view, but Rand is only allowing for there to be two alternatives so that she can, when she dismisses one, she has us commit to the other. If there's another alternative or multiple other alternatives, then just ruling out ethics of altruism doesn't commit us automatically to ethics of egoism. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Rachels gives us some other arguments for ethical egoism that he doesn't think are particularly effective. Then he gives us some arguments against ethical egoism, which he also thinks are not very effective, except for the final one he considers, which he thinks is the most compelling. So arguments that are usually given for ethical egoism tend to involve some kind of practical consideration, like in fact, the way we serve others' interests best is by pursuing our own interests. But Rachel points out arguments like this are not really arguments for ethical egoism. They're saying that they're presupposing the importance of acting in other people's interests, but they're just saying there's a particular way you do that, which is by pursuing your own interests. And there could be different reasons for this. It could be because each of us knows our own interests the best, and we would be invading on other people's privacy if we were to sort of guess at their interests and then try to prioritize them. So we should act on our own interests, and the result is going to be the most people's interests being satisfied. So the assumption is that's what you want, right? You want to satisfy other people's interests or the most people's interests. But that's not what the ethical egoist is saying. They're saying what's valuable, what's right, is you meeting your interests. So that's not an argument for ethical egoism. The other arguments, the other two he considers, involve some kind of incoherence that actually, I'll come back to that. The arguments concerning incoherence are the arguments against ethical egoism. So, for example, Kurt Beyer, who's a contemporary moral philosopher, argues that ethical egoism cannot be a view, it doesn't work as a view about what morality is, what the right thing is, because morality serves to solve conflicts of interest, and ethical egoism doesn't do that. It doesn't give us any means to do that, because it's just you going after what you want, me going after what I want. Given scarcity of resources, we're going to have a conflict at some point. We're both doing the right thing, so there's no way to say, okay, let's see what the right thing to do is in this situation, whose interests take priority, and what should you concede that the right thing to do is to allow someone else's interest to take priority. Of course, the egoist can respond, this is the problem for Beyer. The egoist can respond and say, yeah, but I don't think morality is about resolving conflicts. I think of life as just an endless series of conflicts, and we need to just go after our own interests. The second argument that Rachel also doesn't think works against ethical egoism points to some kind of inattention in the view. It says, look, maybe it's in your interest to, I don't know, kill me, but that's not in my interests, so I want to resist. It would be wrong for me to let you kill me, right? It's not in my interests. But it's also wrong to interfere with the projects of others. So that makes me resisting your attack both right and wrong for me. That's incoherent. But there's a way the egoist can respond. You're assuming, the proponent of this argument is assuming that it's wrong to interfere with others' projects. Why do you think that? You haven't defended that claim. The egoist could deny it and say, no, there's no conflict here. It's right for you to attack me. It's right for me to resist. It's just going to be a matter of who's more powerful as to who gets their interests served in this situation. But nobody's doing anything wrong. End of story. So not a great argument. I mean, it's important to recognize that philosophers want to put forward these arguments. Hardly any moral philosophers subscribe to ethical egoism. Most assume that when we act rightly, we take other people's interests into account. That's just what it is to act rightly or do the right thing. But they see the threat of ethical egoism, just the mere possibility that it could be right, as enough to motivate them to come up with arguments. But as we saw with these two concerning resolving conflicts and avoiding incoherence, something's being both right and wrong, it's difficult to come up with arguments, conclusive ones, against ethical egoism. Except Rachel thinks there's one argument that might work, and it also tells us something about why we do in fact try to do the right thing in the sense of taking others' interests into account. So the argument involves looking at some really troubling views like racism or anti-Semitism or sexism that seem to divide the world into two groups, oneself and everyone else. Or oneself, or it depends on the group, or it depends on the view. So a racist view might divide the world into white people and non-white people, right? And then the racist will say the interests of the former group, the white people, they're more important. They weigh more heavily than the interests of the non-white group. So we act in such a way as to weight the interests of the privileged group. That's what the right thing to do. And Rachel points out that egoism, ethical egoism, is a view just like that. It involves dividing the world up and saying, in this group, the people in this group, their interests matter less than the people in this group. So to do the right thing, you focus on the interests of one group. With egoism, the two groups are just you, yourself, group one, and everybody else, group two. You prioritize the interests of group one. That's how you do the right thing. Other people's interests just don't matter or shouldn't factor into your decision making. But as with racism, as with anti-Semitism, as with sexism, egoism, if it requires an argument for why one group's interests count more than another group's interests. What is it about you? What is it about white people? What is it about men that makes them special, makes their interests count more? Trying to find like a factual difference that has moral relevance, it's very difficult. So in the case of ethical egoism, what is it about you that makes your interests weigh more heavily than everybody else's? Is there something you have that nobody else has? I mean, surely you're not more intelligent, more beautiful, more athletically talented than everyone ever, right? It's going to be really hard to find something. And even if you could find something, Like, you are the most amazing basketball player in the whole history of humankind. Why does that have moral relevance, right? Why does your incredible basketball playing skill mean that you count more morally, right? So the egoist, just like the racist, just like the anti-Semitic, is facing this problem of weighting groups' interests and not having a reason for doing so. And Rachel thinks this also tells us something about why we try to do the right thing, why we want to take people's and should take other people's interests into account, because other people's interests don't in fact count less than ours. Our interests don't count more. People whose homes and livelihoods have just been destroyed in Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas. We want to help them. We think we should if we can, because we have exactly the same vulnerabilities as them. We need food and shelter and clean water and work, right, to survive, at least in this economic system. So it could be us, and they have the same basic needs as us. And we think in our case, it's important to have enough food and water, and in the case of our loved ones, so it's equally important in the case of people in the Bahamas who we don't know. We all have these basic interests, which is also what we talked about when considering objectivism last time. All right, that is our topic for today, and I will see you in class.